Thank you very much, Charles, for the prize, but particularly for your critical friendship since '68, which has been extremely meaningful background against my whole career. And I am very honest when I say that without you, I would have been a much sloppier architect. Basically, I'm having difficulty with awards. They are always a little bit like a wake. And therefore I try to find a way to show that I'm still alive. And what I'm kind of trying to do is to give a lecture about 4 unrealized ambitions that I still carry, and time will tell whether I will kind of succeed in these ambitions. So since we also have a conversation and also a conversation with the audience, I'll simply proceed. 4 ambitions. It's probably a good thing for an architect to be born in this city at this moment, because the whole idea of change is radically present, and the whole idea of reconstruction is equally present. It's probably also a good idea for the parents of an architect to take their child to a completely a country on the other side of the world. It's probably a good idea to be taken to Indonesia, to a recently independent country, with no sympathy for the Dutch, and therefore an obligation to go and live like an Indonesian and speak Indonesian, and therefore have a kind of early experience with other cultures, other religions. It's also probably a good idea to be in Paris in '68, not as a revolutionary, but as a journalist and as a kind of witness to a process. And it is probably also a good idea to be an emerging architect at the end of the Cold War. Maybe this is an unusual kind of theory, but I think the Cold War was a moment of exceptional mutual intelligence and preoccupation, when one half of the world knew more about the other half than currently is the case. So it was a kind of charged condition that I think was important. It is probably also important to start my real career at the fall of the wall at the end of the 80s, at a moment where, as is well known, the end of history was imminent. Fukuyama proclaimed it, and where the expectation was that kind of after this bloc organization, the West, the East, and the non-aligned, the entire world would turn into a neoliberal paradise. But the market economy intervened, and the market economy had kind of drastic consequences for architecture. You could be a respectable architect in the late 50s by doing this kind of work, but to be an architect in the early part of the 21st century, you had to be a salesman and sell in very often difficult conditions your work. There was no a priori effect. I think the market economy made it impossible to be an architect like this person that I always look at with envy, because this architect is obviously not a very interesting person. He is witnessing the blueprints of his design, but he has his back to the building that is being kind of realized, in the full confidence that the building behind him will be the faithful execution of the plans in front of him. And he also knows that that his work is serving mankind. And I'm very envious of this person, because this certainty, both the certainty that things will be as you want them, but also that you serve a noble purpose, we don't have anymore. And this world has become inaccessible to us. We have draw a lot of attention But this is an analysis that our office made of covers of Time with architects on the covers. Then we saw a lot of architects on the covers in the decade of the 30s, a lot of architects in the decade of the 50s, 40s, the 50s, the 60s, very good for architects. And the last architect on the cover of Time was in 1979, Philip Johnson, Charles and Bob Stern's very good friend. And the last moment of an architect on the cover of Time was at the beginning of Wall Street's incredible explosion. So I think that this analysis really proves once and for all that although we gained in notoriety, we lost in credibility, and that the market economy is the fault. 9/11 exacerbated this condition, in my view, because it introduced, or was the beginning of a kind of bifurcation or division of the world in a part that is not, if not shrinking, at least struggling, and another part that is very vigorously developing, and developing since we are struggling, not in a way which reflects our values, but on the contrary, exploring all kinds of autonomous values on its own. So where at the end of communism this could be the prognosis, or actually was the prognosis, we are now kind of in a situation that prognosis seems to be kind of way too optimistic, and that we are in a much more complex environment than we thought at the time, and we are operating in this condition, and where we have a kind of patchwork of different political systems, a patchwork of values and religions, all of them incredibly intricately connected and therefore hard to understand and to entirely decipher. And this is the field in which we operate right now. And so I basically want to show unrealized ambitions, and this is one of them. I'm incredibly interested in looking at the world, or this part of the world, in the same way as Herodotus, and to see if connections cannot be made between all these different parts. And the blue dots are where we're working. And that kind of really implies that for each of our works, there is, apart from the work itself, an effort and an attempt to also intervene in the culture, or intervene in the religion, or intervene even in the political system. I think there's a kind of really serious obligation to communicate. I believe that architecture can be one of the tools of that communication. It rarely is, unfortunately, but I think architecture is involved in almost any of these fields and has something to say about it. So for me, CCTV is not kind of simply a building or a form, but it's a form of engagement, and particularly an engagement, as in this case, for instance, with Chinese engineers. CCTV is a building where gravity does not work according to straightforward Marxist laws, that it goes through the shortest path from the top to the bottom. But gravity it's an engagement with gravity, an engagement that initially shocked the Chinese engineers, the 150 professors who had to check our work, and whom we met over 2 or 3 years in an intense dialogue, where in the end we could convince them that what we did was not frivolous, was not irresponsible, but was in itself a gesture to liberating Newtonian physics, and a gesture to imagine structure in a more imaginative way. Of course, it's not my work alone, but I work with Cecil Baumann, who had the prize before. So for me, this is a kind of totally undiscussed part of architecture, but it was a very crucial part of architecture. In a similar way in which we're now working in Doha on many different but interconnected ways in Qatar. And I would like to simply take Qatar as a kind of prototype, perhaps, of what is possible in this new world and how each of these worlds is radically different. what is truly amazing and rarely realized in Qatar is that on 2 million people, only 300,000 are Qataris. And that therefore, where we are struggling with immigrants and countries like France are really in a kind of state of crisis through immigration, we have to admire other countries that are living with immigration on a colossal scale, where they are absolutely themselves a minority, and therefore it's impossible, apart from all the other things you can say about conditions, etc., to not also look at this as a part of tolerance. Qatar is a country that focuses on many different, seemingly incompatible entities. Here, the royal family celebrates itself by acquiring the soccer cup. It invests on an enormous scale on art, and it is hyper politically active. So that you could say that Qatar has a colossal footprint. It's a tiny city-state with a footprint that is now global, and that kind of simply creates a layering of all these different involvements, even to the point where it's correcting Europe's problems with an investment of 150 million euro in the banlieue of Paris. So what is Qatar? A country that no longer keeps categories that we keep separate. For Qatar, this encounter is as important as this encounter. This is the daughter of the royal family bicycling with Jacques Anquetil, the former winner of the Tour de France. And what the country is trying to do is create a kind of patchwork of different forms of excellence. And this is public art there against the skyline. And it really makes me think, and gives me a feeling that what we're witnessing here is a kind of 21st century interpretation of statehood and politics. Because where we keep all these categories separate and clearly as autonomous, in Qatar they create a kind of single bandwidth, a continuous form of entertainment, education, values, and other conditions. And for me, it is kind of very exciting to be almost like an acupuncturist involved in many of these operations that try to become a single entity. And so this is a kind of small prototype of how I would like to read our involvement in this moment of globalization, where the kind of cementing, perhaps, relationships between different countries is crucial. A second ambition that I have not given up is the ambition to do a book on Lagos. And I will kind of explain why. I first went to Lagos in '96, and that was a strange moment. Because it was the moment that Nigeria was doing, at the end of a series of dictatorships, incredibly badly. It was a moment that the State Department discouraged people to go. It was a moment that Lagos was almost entirely unknown. You couldn't look at it in any of the media. So it was really a low point of its existence. At the same time, the fact that I, as an architect, relatively well known, would visit it was treated not by Lagosians, but mostly by the outside, with incredible suspicion. And I have to admit that the reason I didn't write a book is that I was kind of finally intimidated by this suspicion and all the forms it took. What is unbelievably moving and gripping about Lagos is that what seems at first sight an incredible chaos and turmoil on the ground. It seems as half of the city is permanently burning. There is an incredible amount of movement. There are barely any kind of recognizable municipal services, and there is a kind of hyperactivity. And so in order to understand what we were seeing, we were constantly forced to, on the one hand, look on the ground, and this is a typical ground image, very hard to decipher, and from above, because then if you look from above, you can somehow see that what looks at first sight maybe as chaos is actually a structured movement of tree trunks that arrive, that are the sawdust is burned, and that are then turning into planks. And the more we looked at Lagos, so here is a kind of similar example, a rubbish dump, with some human life. You see it here, very hard to distinguish. And if you look better, actually in the second look, you see that it's not simply rubbish, but that there is also a process going on of a degree of consolidation and a degree perhaps even of recycling. You see that from tin, new things are being made, so that in the end, image like this one, for me, is a kind of perplexing image where you both see chaos and order in a kind of mutual embrace. And what you also see is that this embrace is perhaps, or this condition that at first sight seems to be completely spontaneous, is actually perhaps framed by elements of infrastructure, or maybe you should say dysfunctional elements of former infrastructure. So what seems utterly spontaneous is perhaps designed. And what we discovered on our journeys was that actually, yes, in the 60s and the 70s, a design had been made for Lagos by German engineers, and that explains the huge wrist that had kind of tried to capture the entire city in a kind of network of infrastructure, and it was kind of probably not a coincidence that all these most intense activities were taking place in the kind of remnants and pockets of that infrastructure. So for me, it was a kind of incredibly intense learning experience, because what I first thought was self-organization, which at that time was a kind of very highly fashionable concept, and where I first thought that simply the city was displaying a kind of form of intelligence and a form of creative action that was absent in our societies. If we have to take perhaps 30 important decisions in a certain day, in Lagos it was clear that people probably had to take 5,000 decisions kind of constantly to survive. That actually the situation was much more complex, because it was an amalgamation of self-organization, crisis, and the former organization of modernism, all in one. And so the reason that I didn't write the book was kind of was a really incredible campaign where I was kind of simply my activity had been interpreted as an incredible coward, too intimidated to leave his car, and out of fear renting the president's helicopter, but in fact we had been going kind of from ground to air in a continuous alternation. And so as a very confrontational kind of moment, on my last visit to Lagos, I met the new governor of Lagos, who received me, and I have to kind of really embarrassingly say, as a hero, because before his election, someone gave him the video that I had made about my journey for his birthday. That night he couldn't sleep. The picture it suggested of Lagos had kept him awake. Next day he gave illegal copies to all his collaborators. This is the city that we will inherit. The video had defined a large part of his program. Suddenly I sensed violent goosebumps. Is this the most emphatic confirmation of a professional usefulness I've ever encountered? But anyway, so for me the wrenching movement of this discredit in the West and credit in a different location has been, a persistent a persistent effect, I would say, which of course is also on one hand scary, but on the other hand intimidating. Preservation is another kind of recent field that I want to kind of really decipher, and which I want to redefine. And I say it in a kind of arrogant way, and the reason is that I really believe that there are issues in preservation that are currently so perverse and so decadent that it really is a world that needs to be kind of reinvented, or particularly maybe better to be redefined. When we started with preservation, we looked first when the first laws of preservation were invented, and then the first one was a few years after the French Revolution, and the second one was in the middle of the Victorian Industrial Revolution in England. And of course, there is a logical connection between wanting to preserve a revolution, because in a revolution you destroy everything, so what you want to keep is urgent. But when we looked at the contemporary events and contemporary inventions of these two laws, we discovered that actually these two laws defining preservation coincided with a kind of whole avalanche or a groundswell of modern inventions that could be said to define the whole idea of modernity. So that rather than kind of resisting modernity, preservation is an aspect of modernity. And when we understood that, it became the first key to looking at preservation in a new way. We also looked at the interval between the present and the substance to be preserved. In 1882, it was about 2,000 years. In 1912, it was only 200 years. In the mid-60s, it was kind of reduced to 30 years. And in 2007, the moment of preservation coincided with the present. So I venture a prognosis that preservation will no longer be an activity of retrospective decision, but more activity of prospective decision. You have to know that you want to build something to preserve it. And again, with this logic, we felt we were also introducing perhaps a new domain. We looked at the apparatus that tells us that we need to preserve things, and basically it's a kind of, again, the same form of groundswell, more and more institutions, more and more NGOs that pressure preservation. And this is the scale of UNESCO World Heritage Site, their escalation, their distribution across different continents. But here, all the heritage sites that are in the pipeline. So there's a kind of huge wave of preservation still to come. And when we made a kind of sincere attempt to look at the scale of preservation in the world, and in this case we look both at physical substance, history, and nature, we discovered that about 12% of the world's surface, the entire surface, including the sea, is under some regime of preservation, so that we are facing an issue that we are all full of the cliche that the world is changing so fast, but at the same time, inside that there is a kind of world of radical stasis. So on the one hand, radical transformation and radical stasis, and we are not ready to theorize that kind of, again, wrenching movement between the two. We then looked at Wall Street. We always look at Wall Street. The number of World Heritage Sites that show exactly the parallel increase with Wall Street, and the number of tourism. Numbers of tourism, and so in these kind of fatal embrace of heritage, money and the economy, I think another story is kind of revealed. And if I look at my own preferences in preservation or my own experiences with preservation, I would say that I like my own preservation role. Maybe one of the most beautiful moments of preservation is this casts of bodies burned in Pompeii, found in the ash and kind of simply represented in clay. Another amazing image of preservation is an abandoned school in Chernobyl, decades later, but still completely intact. And I think it's these moments of preservation that are unbelievably powerful and forceful. In a similar way, preservation, this is an image of a store in Beirut, a store in Damascus. It could be hundreds of years old, and you kind of realize that a particular way of life that again could be hundreds or even thousands of years old has been present here and is still present. And this is a store next door in Beirut that is preserved and turned into a kind of fashion house with all the kind of implements of fashion and including technology. So an involvement with preservation must, for me, in a large extent, be a campaign against preservation, because somehow real preservation would be an art or a science that was able to maintain this condition over time and avoid the transformation of this condition in kind of something much more recognizable. This is one of my favorite corners in the world. I cannot exactly explain why, but I would love to preserve it. But I also know that there is simply no framework or no argument or no economy or no ideology and no political system that would ever support me in my thesis. And therefore, I've been kind of thinking, and we have been thinking in how we could find other models of preservation. This is a kind of test on Beijing. Preservation typically preserves the beautiful, the old, and the important. Important architects are preserved, but the strongest argument for preservation is, of course, that you are able to remember history or that you are able to reconstruct history. And if you only preserve the beautiful, of course you distort history. So this was an essay to say, in order to do pure preservation, you should have a kind of random point grid of preserved areas, so that whatever happens around it, you will also preserve a particular moment. And whether that moment was ugly, mediocre, compromised, absurd, you preserve it so that later generations are able to enjoy it and have the kind of intelligence of history there in front of their eyes. And the same thing, you could also kind of preserve a wedge of museum. So experimenting with this direction inspired me and inspired us to look at the Hermitage Museum, which is a kind of huge museum which was facing the issue of extending its properties with one new museum, which was incredibly decrepit, made me produce a number of projects where I was looking into the possibility of preserving decay as a meaningful issue. This building had been used by the Soviet army. Wherever you looked, you found kind of Soviet pornography, Soviet cartoons, Soviet strips, Soviet everything. And so the combination of dilapidation, destruction, debris was so important after the arrival of the Putin regime that actually it seemed important to make it part of the museum. So therefore we did kind of experimentations that in the most dilapidated parts of the museum you could somehow show the most important art, maybe also ancient, so that there would be a resonance of ages. Of course, again, a kind of preservation project that went nowhere, but still the mentality is kind of embodied in a number of things and arguments that we hold dearly. I want to finally talk about the fourth ambition, which is an ambition to look at the countryside, which we are recently looking at kind of very carefully. Of course, our career seems dedicated to singing the praises of the metropolis. Our name is about the metropolis. We looked at New York, the archetypal metropolis, and seemingly we have been kind of betting on the right horse, because the cliche that more than half of mankind now lives in urban conditions is well established by now. We all know it, and we have contributed to it, to the equation that the world is a city, through our earlier work. But if you look carefully, and this is an average newspaper magazine shelf in an average European city, and you eliminate everything which is not connected to the countryside, there's a kind of amazing section that is dealing with the countryside. So clearly countryside is still a viable and even urgent entity, in the sense that about 50% of magazines is dealing with it. 2% of the surface is now concerned with cities or occupied by cities. That means that if we don't look at the countryside, we are basically structurally ignoring 98% of the world, which seems a bit irresponsible. So we started looking and trying to understand images like this one, and trying to understand what is going on in this picture. And so I announce here a fourth ambition, which is to write a book on the countryside. And I hope to be able to do it with a kind of combined literary precision of Tolstoy and Welbeck, and try to record over time what we have lost and perhaps what we have gained. For me, this is a very beautiful picture. It's 1909 by a Russian photographer who was asked by the Tsar to document the entire country. And I think it's beautiful because what you see is kind of decaying architecture, but three women in front of the axis of the decaying architecture. They hold products. They are clearly proud of the products. The products are probably natural and probably related to berries. And they have national or local costumes. And what the image conveys to me is that it's a situation where everyone shows and shares a certain shared expectation of what life is about, how life is led, how you address life, how you dress for life, and what you do in life. And it has a certain nobility, which in this picture, which I took 100 years later in Switzerland, that dignity is lost. These are three Thai women that inhabit a village in Switzerland because they have to look after second houses for rich Milanese people. They wear jeans. They look after the pets of the house. They maintain the houses. And they also occasionally look after the children. And so what I want to understand in this book is the difference between this picture and simply ask the question, what happened? And we're beginning to see partly what happened, because simply our focus on the city has made us oblivious to changes in the countryside, changes as this one, but also changes where, for instance, in Switzerland, because of reasons of meat production, different cows are being imported, so that kind of suddenly in Greek Swiss meadows you see completely unfamiliar American cows that produce more flesh and that have faces that kind of somehow don't look right in the circumstances. You see farmers, so-called farmers, but when I asked him if he was from a farmer family, he said, no, of course not. I'm a nuclear scientist from Frankfurt. And since 89, he has been kind of maintaining sections of Switzerland that were about to be abandoned. And if you look carefully, you also see that kind of seemingly familiar elements of the countryside, like tractors that have had their kind of own mythology in the 20th century as the great transformers of the Soviet Union, kind of Russia, etc., are now actually more complicated machines because they are equipped with laptops. So actually they have been becoming part of the digital domain. And basically what you see on this laptop is how each of the fields is pixelated, their yield every year recorded, so that the machines of the tractor seed and add fertilizer in exactly the right doses for each of the exact points of the field. So farming is now kind of simply watching things on a laptop and see that really the last possible harvest is extracted from each of the smallest kind of surfaces. So where this used to be the land, now this is the land. And so our tablet has kind of replaced ground, and the farmer is somebody behind the desk looking at spreadsheets and very often able to take free time and manage his farm on the mobile, or even use drones to be even more scientific for the total extraction of the earth. So that may seem not so bad, or maybe it makes perfect sense. If you produce architecture, why not be thorough? And if the digital helps you, it can only be good. But this digital process is going and invading kind of very unexpected parts of the world. This is the combined rules and the combined laws of the EU. It's 7,000 pages. But these laws kind of dictate the transaction between agricultural producers in the rest of the world, Africa, Indonesia, and South America, and Europe. And so very, very complex computer programs are made for each and every one of these entities. And basically, the digital is also extended to these producing countries under a kind of form of constant instruction. So the laws of the EU now translated in digital information and digital kind of request, so that basically every tree in the world, before it is imported in Europe, tracked and counted and controlled before it actually goes. So that if this is a kind of typical Google image of a jungle, you now see kind of viewings of either illegal logging, kind of animals, sightings. So the picture of the jungle has become considerably less innocent and more known. And this kind of tracking of the smallest part of the countryside seems to be crucial to the new countryside, where you see, while our cities and villages are becoming, to some extent, more and more appealing and picturesque, the countryside is now increasingly the territory where enormous complexes are built according to strict Cartesian lines, that whether it is agriculture or server farms or all the other needs for our seemingly casual society are increasingly organized in the countryside. Whether it is for food, artificial food, or servers, or the digital world, all of them occupying larger and larger territory of a kind of hyper-organization. So that what I really would like to finally decipher in this book is whether there is a kind of secret connection between the grandiose Cartesian reorganization of the countryside and the whimsicality that we pursue in our cities. Whether these two are have a kind of hidden connection, and where the one is dependent on the other. Thank you.